busy. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar, the Organic Growers Alliance. It's not the most lively or scenic of issues we're discussing tonight. There's not going to be a lot of pictures of growing crops, but it is an issue that's played a big part in the life and the career of a lot of organic growers and livestock farmers as well. But we're concentrating specifically on growers here, because often the planning system hasn't recognised the needs of growers to live on the land. It is an important issue for a lot of people and can be a real headache. So tonight we've got Bill Knight and James Shorten here, who are planning consultants and growers who've worked on applications and appeals for a number of about 20 applications. I think they've helped growers to get, to explain the planning system, to explain what you need to do, the tests you need to satisfy to get residential planning permission. And then I'll follow with a short sort of case study because I've had 2 planning applications over my 20 years as a grower. One temporary that failed at appeal, I lost, but recently got full permission for a house to support the business. Actually, the room I'm sat in is a condition of planning because the house has to have a farm office in it. But I'll pass you over to Bill now to explain the bones and the issues of planning.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, hi everybody. So I'm Bill Knight. My colleague James will be joining us a little bit later on, and we'll both be in for a Q&A session at the end. So yeah, I'm a veg grower. I've run a veg box scheme, a place called Kevrel Farm down in Cornwall since 1997 until a few years ago, where I've slowly backed myself out of growing and increasingly been picking up doing agricultural appraisals and support for other growers who are looking to get planning permission to live on their sites. Yeah, as Jim said, we've helped 25 people over the last few years to get permissions to live on the sites, and we've worked particularly hard to make the essential need case for horticulturalists, people who are genuinely setting up good, viable, small, intensive horticulture businesses. We also work quite a lot with people who are doing one planet developments. Those of you in Wales will know your government's got a one planet development policy, which allows people to live in the countryside in a way that's slightly different from rural workers' dwellings. We're not going to get into that tonight, but that's like a slightly different way. If you're not really a commercial business, you could possibly, but you want to be very, very sustainable and you still want to get quite a lot of your resources from the land, perhaps low impact planning or one planet development policies are for you. Nationally, that exists across Wales. There is a policy that's recently come into place in Cornwall, and Dartmoor have one at the moment. They're the only ones I'm aware of in England at the moment, but we're trying to promote it, generally speaking. Right, so let's get moving on. First of all, I just want to go through the process of planning. Some of you may have gone through this, most people probably haven't. So when you're applying for planning permission for a rural workers dwelling, there's a bunch of different bits of information that you need to prepare. Now, we're not going to go into all of that in any great depth this evening. So there's general documents and drawings that you need for any sort of planning application. They'll be site specific and they'll depend on the criteria of your local planning authority. There'll be things like wildlife surveys and assessments of landscape impacts. You need to explain how you're going to make your drainage work and your sewage. You may need to justify some of your transport impacts and show that your site's suitable for having vehicles coming off onto the road. You'll need some sort of drawings of buildings. You may not need that if you're planning to live in a caravan, but that's a slightly different technical matter. And generally you need a thing called a planning statement, which is a document which explains what you're proposing to do and why you should be given permission to do it. And those are things that you would need for any planning permission. And those will be looked at by the planning officer at the council, who will then decide whether or not you should be given permission broadly. For a rural workers dwelling, there's some very, very specific other business evidence that you need to present, and that's what tonight's about. So this is confidential information. It shouldn't be posted. The other documents I've talked about, that'll get posted up on the council's websites. But the business specific confidential stuff shouldn't be made public. Sometimes you need to remind them that it's confidential, but they will get shared with somebody like the council's land agent or possibly an external agricultural consultant, who the count is. That's like the council's person who will be assessing whether or not you meet the needs of the policy for a rural workers dwelling. You'll be asked, so this session this evening is about us giving you the heads up on the records that you need to be keeping from the day one of trying to set up your business, what information you should present to the council, and very importantly, how you should present it to the council. One of the big problems that we've come across over the years is that the county land agents, the agricultural consultants employed by the council, they're really not familiar with smaller, particularly horticultural businesses. They're often very suspicious of people on small holdings. They just think your chances who want to try and live in the countryside and aren't genuine about trying to establish a proper rural business. And they also don't consider what are in all other ways very successful small businesses to be a proper business for some reason. So you'd be really well advised to get a third party appraisal of your business. So give with the evidence that you also need to give to the council. There are a variety of people out there who will do that for you. We provide that service, but there's other people out there who can help you do that. But it's really important to find somebody who will understand the sort of business that you're looking to run or you do run, and can articulate that and can advocate on your behalf to the council and counter these somewhat old-fashioned opinions that some of the ag consultants and land agents have. So anyway, moving along, policies. The planning's all about policy, and there's a lot of different sorts of policy and levels of policy. Again, I'm not going to go into this in great depth because it's very, very dull, but it's just to explain some of the terminology. You'll have your local policy, it might be called your local development plan, and every local planning authority or council has pretty similar policies that address rural workers dwellings. They might be called agricultural workers dwellings, they might be called housing in the countryside, something like that. Quite a lot of councils also have things that are called supplementary planning documents, SPDs or DPDs. They might be called something like a rural workers dwelling SPD or a housing in the countryside policy SPD. And these are not policy, these are guidance from the council to applicants and to themselves as to how they think they should look at your application. And they often contain things that are frankly wrong and biased against smaller growers, and we'll get into that further on in. You might also have a neighbourhood plan, which is like your local parish plan, sometimes they're called. Sometimes those can be helpful. Sometimes those actually look to support small businesses and people who are trying to actively do things in the countryside. Sometimes they're not helpful, but it might be useful. On top of both those layers, you've got your national policy, and then on top of that is court rulings. And the important thing about court rulings is they are binding on the people who are making the decisions about your planning application. So it doesn't matter what their policy says, each application is determined on its own merits. And at the end of the day, if push comes to shove and you end up in front of an inspector, there are some court decisions that really can help to determine whether you get your permission or not. So all policy will, they need you to determine, or to demonstrate a bunch of things. They need you to demonstrate essential need. That's a term that's often used. That's the need for you to be resident on your site in order for the business to operate effectively and remain profitable. That quite often gets misrepresented, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. You need to demonstrate that it's a full-time need. Your business is a full-time thing. For the farm, again, we'll go into that in a little bit more depth. You need to demonstrate that your business is profitable, or that it will be in a few years' time. And you need to demonstrate that your business is viable, and either viable now or it will be viable in a few years' time. And this issue of profitability and viability is the main reason why you probably have heard that you get temporary permissions and permanent permissions. And temporary permissions are normally granted in order so that you can prove that the plan that you presented to the council saying, look, this is what I'm planning to do, this is how it's all going to work, look, it's going to make me £1 million a year in a few years' time. They can come back in a few years' time, say, well, how's it going now? And you can prove it to them, and then you get a permanent permission. Other things that you need to demonstrate are that you're sincere about it, you have the intention to actually do the things you say you're going to do, and that you've got the ability to do it. And also you need to demonstrate there isn't anywhere else suitable that you could be living, either on your site, if there's a building that isn't being used, or close by. And those are all things that you've got to try and demonstrate in order to succeed. Anyway, once you've got all those things together, you'll hand them over to the council, and the planning officer will run away and decide whether or not you're going to get permission, and that will normally take about 8 weeks. It can take longer if things are controversial. When you submit, that's the time for you to start to think about getting your local support in. So once you've submitted, there's a consultation period, and that's when all your people who know you locally can write letters to the council, or post on their website saying what a great business you are and how they support you and how you really deserve to be allowed to live on your land. And it's also, very importantly, your planning application will go out for consultation, and amongst the people that will be consulted are your local parish council. And it's very important for you guys out there who put applications in to find out when your local parish council is looking at applications, when your application will be looked at, and you're allowed to go along and spend a few minutes pitching for yourself to explain who you are, what you're doing, how the business works, all the good things that you do for the local community. And that can really help you in the process of getting your permission. So it's really, really worthwhile making the time to do that and reaching out to people before you put your application in as well, if you can. But very, very specifically at that point, once you've submitted, make sure you're all geared up to get this local support coming in, because that will help you. So, and once you put your permission in, you'll either get a temporary permission if you haven't been able to provide enough information to demonstrate for a fact that you're going to be profitable and viable, or you get a permanent permission if you can demonstrate those things, or you'll be refused, and we'll come to that later on. So, right, now I'm going to go into all these individual parts. So the most important test generally is essential need. So national policy says that you can have a new home in the countryside if there is an essential need for a rural worker to live permanently at or near their place of work. So what is this essential need thing, and how do you demonstrate it? So it's traditionally often taken by planning officers and ag consultants to be the need to be available at short notice to address emergency situations. And if those things aren't attended to, they'd lead to loss and damage that would impact the profitability of your business. And you'll hear people using terms like within sight and sound, or need to be available at most times of the day and night. And these are nearly always interpreted to apply to livestock and nothing else, and not to crops. But that isn't actually what policy says. The national planning guidance says considerations that may be relevant to take into account when applying for planning for a rural workers dwelling could include evidence of the necessity for a rural worker to live at or close proximity to their place of work to ensure the effective operation of an agricultural, forestry, or similar land-based rural enterprise. So that's the key thing, effective operation. It goes on to give examples. It says, you know, for instance, where farm animals require on-site attention, or agricultural processes require on-site attention. It also says animals require attention 24 hours a day, as an example, where otherwise there would be a risk to human health, or there would be a risk to animal health, or there is a risk from crime, or to deal with emergencies that could cause serious loss of crops or products. That's great, it says those things, but those are only examples, and it actually definitely says these are examples. What you need to provide is evidence of your necessity to live close to your place of work to ensure the effective operation of your enterprise. And that's where we've won a number of appeals about what actually constitutes essential need. And a lot of other people have built up a series of wins at appeal about this. Lots of people like ELC and Rebecca Loughton, who's working for the Land Workers Alliance now, Simon Fairley. These people have put years and years of work into getting people through their planning permissions, and we've helped to beat away at some of this sort of dogma. So things that you can do, records and things that you can keep from the start of getting going with your business that will help you with this. Get evidence together of the pattern of your working life. I'm sure that very few of you out there do a 9 till 5 job on your farm, and there will be times when you take plenty of time out during the day because you've been up early, hard at it in the morning, or you're going to be hard at it late into the evening, or you'll be out at the weekend doing a market, or you know, all the different things that mean you don't do a 9 till 5 when you do this sort of work, and we all know that. So think about how your enterprise operates and start to gather the evidence from the start to show the pattern of your working life. Think about when you need to be available through the day, through the week, through the months and the year, at different times of the year. Think about how it varies seasonally. Think about how you integrate all the various tasks on your holding so that it actually operates effectively. Think about all the little things that you do, almost in passing sometimes, that actually make it all work. And if you weren't there to be able to do that, how it wouldn't work, or your costs would go up a great deal, or you would miss things that might lead to losses. So all the stuff you're aware of with managing a holding. Think about your seed care and your plant raising. Think about managing the environments in the sheltered cropping, your temperature, your humidity, your shade maybe, your bed preparations, your planting and sowing, your weed control, your pest control, putting on, taking off your crop covers, when do you manage your fertility, what do you do about fertility building, think about your watering, your harvesting, your packing, your delivering, your maintenance of your machinery, your maintenance of your hand tools, the maintenance of the wider site, so your buildings. Most importantly, think about all the checking and observing that you do. The attention to detail is really important to try and convey to the people looking at this. It's quite often, it's not stuff that you can say, this I do 5 hours a week doing this, but it's the things that you do around other tasks. You know, the evening walks, maybe you can't add that to your day's work, but that's when you're out there thinking about things and spotting stuff that maybe you've missed at other times. Looking at the crops whilst you're setting up your watering, perhaps checking the bottom of your trays for snails whilst you're just passing through the tunnel in the morning, popping out from your house to check if something was done because you're not sure if it was tended to the right way. All that sort of stuff adds to your case to how you operate effectively. Think about how your tasks get done at the right time and in the right order because of the weather conditions or because of other constraints on when you get to do things. Think about how you fit in times for deliveries and sales around your production, how you fit in your admin, how you fit in the wider management of your holding. Obviously, if you've got livestock, then all of that would slip into this too, but we're specifically focusing on trying to make this case that's predominantly about horticulture at the moment. So I'm going to share a screen to you, I hope. Let me see. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Can somebody let me know they can see that okay?
Yes, I can see it, Bill.
Great, thank you. Right, okay, so I can't claim credit for this one. This one came from a chap called Jim Budden, who runs a business called Jim's Organic Veg in Higher Hacknell Farm in North Devon. And Jim, bless him, is currently going through an appeal because the council wouldn't accept that he had an essential need or various other things about his land. We're hoping we can get that overturned at appeal. Anyway, you can see what he's done. Hopefully along the bottom here, you can see February, April, June, August, October, December. So these are sort of typical months at different times of the year. And then on the actual spreadsheet itself, there's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Every day of the week is down here. And down the left-hand side here, you can see you've got time slots. In basically, it's 7.5 minute slots. 0.125 of an hour is 7.5 minutes. Starting at 4:15 in this particular case and going through till 9:30, but you know, this is the sort of thing that will be really helpful to you to keep some sort of record like this, so you can think, when do I actually do these different things? So hopefully you can see there's some example tasks down the side here and the time recorded against it, from when you start to when you stop. And you add all those up together and you then come up with how many hours you've worked in a day. But more importantly, you've got the pattern of when you're working in the day. So you can show that actually throughout the year at different times, you're starting at different times of the day. You're starting, you've got some early starts, you've got some late finishes. And that can all, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Hopefully you've got the picture. That's just one example of how somebody has done their record keeping to try and demonstrate these things. Right, so try and keep all those records. You can also think about things like subsistence elements of your life. If you keep some domestic livestock, it isn't part of your commercial business, but you do it to try and support yourself. Perhaps you harvest fuel wood or something for yourself. Those sorts of things too can all feed into this. Think about how all of this maintains and enhances your physical and mental health. That's sometimes been a factor in some of the decisions that are made. Think about pacing and planning. Think about, you know, managing your physical workload. You may have to split up your tasks so that you don't knacker yourself. You can think about how this all integrates around your household commitments. You've got a right to a family life. But you shouldn't really focus on that as your main reason for an essential need, and you shouldn't start talking about things like lifestyle. That's a red rag to planners. This is about the effective operation of your business, not about the effective operation of your nice lifestyle in the countryside. So you've got to be really careful about those differences. Quite often planners will say to you, well, why aren't you using automated systems? Well, you know, they may or may not be right for you. Most people who use automated systems in any sort of serious way do that to enable them to reduce their workload whilst they're actually doing other things, or they're bigger businesses who use it to reduce their labour demand, but there's still somebody there who will be monitoring these things in passing to make sure that they're working, because there's nothing worse than when an automated system cocks up and you don't notice it and you end up losing a bunch of things or damaging something for some reason. Think about how you operate. What am I talking about there? I'm talking about, you know, it's a valid business decision if you've chosen to use lower input systems and less fossil fuels, and that means that you've got a higher labour demand for the things that you do, and that takes a little bit longer than it would do if you were doing it in a more mechanized way. Now, obviously, you need to present however your business operates. I'm just saying that depending on the scale of your business and the sort of land that you're operating from and how you're operating your business, it might be more appropriate for you to have machinery and more mechanization, or it might be equally appropriate for you to not have. So don't let people push you towards the sense that you should be able to do things faster if only you were using this machine or that machine. It might not be right for you, but it might be. Right, so that's the keeping records about this pattern of your working life, the flow of your day, the flow of your seasons. A much more traditional thing to be trying keeping records of is emergency situations. Now every site is different. Make sure you record it. Don't forget things. Don't forget both things that you did sort out because you were there, because you live there, or by good luck you were on the site at the time. But if you hadn't been there at the time, might have gone wrong, and things that did go wrong because you weren't there. So both of those things that happened because you weren't there and things that didn't happen because you were there, both of those things are emergency situations. I'm sure you've got loads of examples of those sorts of things, and maybe we'll get into that later on. But yeah, varies from everybody's got their own stories. Other things you can keep records of: theft and vandalism. Don't just brush it off. Record it, report it. You know, I know the police are not that interested in most things. But if you can get a report in about something that's happened, that will you can use that in evidence to help make an essential need case. The other thing is lack of affordable housing locally can contribute to your essential need. It also helps with this other housing issue, which we'll come back to later. So check it out, record it, record the fact that you can't afford to rent somewhere locally, and that's why you're living in a caravan on your land. And check out how much housing is available around you on a reasonably regular basis, you know, a few times a year. If you have some subsistence livestock, if you're raising chicks or lambing or kidding, or if you've got a few pigs or whatever, those sort of things will also count towards your essential need, even if it isn't actually your main commercial business. So you consider that as well. And the main thing is, it isn't any one thing that makes your essential need. It's a combination of everything that works together to enable you for your business to operate effectively and not sustain losses. And part of operating effectively is you doing things that keep your costs down. And quite often that can be some of the things that you can achieve by living on your site. So that's essential need in a nutshell. I think I'm running on a little bit, so I'll try and speed up. Right, full-time, it's got to be a full-time input. Now, many planning officers and agricultural consultants will want to measure your labour input using standard man days. This is like a measurement system that's been drawn up by John Nicks and his John Nicks pocketbook, and there's also things like the Organic Farm Management Handbook. Standard man days are great for gauging labour input into much larger holdings, but they specifically say in these handbooks that they're not suitable for smaller holdings. They're particularly not suitable for smaller scale owner operating businesses where there's a high labour input, there's a lot less mechanisation than you might find in other bigger farms. There's very intensive cropping systems, sometimes a lot of intercropping. There's a large range of different crops. Perhaps you're raising your own seedlings and you're doing all that alongside direct marketing and a whole bunch of sales activities. So you don't have to justify that you've got a full-time business based on standard man days. It's a valid alternative is appropriate record keeping. So if you have kept good records of your flow of work and what you do when, by using something like that, then half this job will be done for you already. Now, you need to remember that you also might have a whole bunch of other labour input. Of course, if there might be you and your partner working on your holding, there might be woofers or volunteers. You might have seasonal labour that you employ. So you need to do a little bit more than just that spreadsheet that I showed you. But if you keep some good records of what you actually put in, then you can use that when you come to put your applications in to show that you've got a full-time business. You need to be really careful about how you record your hours. Don't double count things. I know we all work really long hours, but remember, the amount of time that you put in feeds into this concept of viability. So if you're, when you put all your hours in and you add them up and you realize you need to have 6 of you to be doing the job that you think you're doing, it's going to be really hard for you to demonstrate that you're earning enough money for that to be a viable business. So just think carefully about how you put things in. I think that's actually part of being a good grower, seeing how you can optimize the time you put in. Now, full-time labour input is generally taken to be, if you're looking at it from a standard mandate point of view, 45 weeks of 39 hours a week, minus some holidays and illness. And then they fiddle it, plus 10 hours a week overtime. So it's actually 45 weeks of 49 hours a week, which works out at 2,200 hours a year. And that's what a lot of ag consultants would say you need to be doing to demonstrate it's a full-time input. Now, if you think about a much more normal human being, including most of the people who'd be looking at your application, they would probably consider a 37, 38, 39 hour a week to be plenty. So that would come to more like 16,000, 17,000 hours a year to be a full-time input. So something between the two and you're pretty much there. Much over 2,200 hours a year, then there's probably need to be a few of you who are somehow contributing to that time to demonstrate it's a viable business. Which brings us on to profitability and viability. So many ag consultants and land agents working for councils will try and suggest to you that you need to generate a profit equivalent to the minimum wage in order to be viable. So as a self-employed owner operator of a business, they're trying to say to you that you're working 2,200 hours a year and earning currently £10.40 an hour for that. So, and this is profit, this isn't turnover. So that would equate to £22,800 profit a year is what your local authority might be suggesting to you you need to be showing in your business plan, or actually in your proper records of your income. Now, if we drop it down to 37 hours a week, which is actually how much is used for the national minimum wage calculations, the 45 weeks of the year, same as the standard mandate calculations, you know, some time off for illness and holidays, then it drops down to 16,070 hours a year. At £10.40, that would be 17,300 odd pounds. It's still a lot of money for a small business to be demonstrating it's making as a profit. And we disagree with that. It isn't policy. There is no policy in the country that says you need to make minimum wage profit to prove that your business is viable. So, however, that is often used as the benchmark by a lot of people who will be looking at this from the other side. Policy says you need to be profitable and viable, and it doesn't set a target level of profitability. So people that you employ, if you're an employer, you're employing a seasonal labourer or a full-time labourer, then you've got to pay them minimum wage. Volunteers, they don't need to be paid minimum wage. Another common trap that I've seen people fall into is that they've set themselves up as something like a CSA or a community interest company, and they are employed themselves by that company. That's a bit of a trap if you're actually trying to live on your site, because if you're employed by a business, then that business must pay you minimum wage, and therefore for you to be profitable and viable, you need to show that you're being paid minimum wage for the hours that you put in. So you should really think about that when you're thinking about the structure of your business. You could consider being a self-employed person who sells your produce to the company instead. You could also do some subcontract labouring to the company, for which you would have to be paid minimum wage, but it means that all the time you put in wouldn't have to be paid at minimum wage. Of course, you could just have a really great business that could afford to pay you that much, but that isn't often the case for new entrants and people who are just setting up their business. Another thing that you should be thinking about is to lay out what your actual financial needs are. Maybe your costs are reduced because you get a lot of your food and your produce from your land. Perhaps you get your firewood from your land. Perhaps you are fortunate enough to own your site outright, and you don't have a rent or a mortgage to pay on it. Perhaps if you're living on your site, you don't need to travel to work so much, so that your costs as an individual are reduced. Perhaps you've got an off-grid site, or you've got a lot of renewables on your site, so you get a lot of your energy at a much lower cost than you would otherwise do. Now, the minimum wage is supposed to cover all of those things. So if you can demonstrate that your costs are actually reduced from the sorts of things that a minimum wage should cover, then you don't need to be so profitable to be viable. And I talked earlier about how court decisions are binding on the decision maker. There's a court decision that said that if you can deliver other benefits to, for example, wildlife and the environment as part of your activities on your holding, then enterprises that are genuine and they operate on close to subsistence basis can be viable on lower levels of profit. Now, I'm not saying aim for subsistence. If you want to be just aiming for a subsistence existence on the land, then perhaps there's other policies like these One Planet policies that are better suited to you. Aim for your best, the most viable business that you can do, but just bear in mind that when people start pulling random levels of profit out of the ether and saying that you've got to meet that level of profit, it's not actually what policy says. So you need to demonstrate viability and profitability. Now, if you're a new business just starting out, how are you going to do that? So you need to put together a reasonable business plan. Now, we don't have time to go into how to do a really good business plan this evening. I can just give you a few tips. Your narrative in your plan needs to explain who you are and what your experience is. You need to explain how you plan to operate, what you're going to be producing. You need to explain who your customers and your markets are going to be. And if you can't evidence it, use market research of some sort. Get emails from people you're likely to supply, restaurants, shops, wholesalers, saying, yeah, we're interested in buying your stuff. We sell 50 kilos of cabbages a week and we'll pay you £2 a head for it. And anything like that you can actually get as evidence to justify the fact that there's a demand out there and some sense of what you might be able to be paid for your produce. That will help you. If you plan to do something like a veg box or direct sales, then try and do customer surveys to people who might be your customers to say, yeah, we'd be interested in buying a veg box, or yeah, we'd buy things from an online shop. Something like that. Anything you can do to gather evidence will make your business plan more plausible. Put your financial projections together properly in a clear sort of cash flow forecast, financial forecast. Don't waffle, just keep things as short and clear and to the point as you can. Just make it clear that you're serious, you've thought about things, you've provided some sort of evidence about why you've come up with the numbers you've come up with. Don't exaggerate. If you're successful in getting your temporary permission, you're going to be back again in 3 or 4 years' time. And the first thing they're going to do is, oh, 3 years ago, you said you were going to be making £60,000 a year. How's it going? And if you've only made 10, it's not going to seem so viable. So try and find that balance between presenting yourself as a serious person who's got a plausible plan, and it is going to make money and it is going to be profitable, great. If you can suggest that in 3 or 4 years' time you will be making something like minimum wage profit, then that's obviously going to be a lot easier for you to make that case. But do bear in mind that you're going to have to come back and explore it all again in a few years' time. Do a few scenarios in your financial planning. Do a things don't go quite so well as I thought scenario, where your costs are maybe a little bit higher than you thought they would be. Your sales are down a little bit. Maybe you had some crop failures. Do a things go about as I thought scenario, where your costs were about right and your sales were okay. And then do a things go really well scenario, where you manage to keep your costs down a little bit and minimize them, and perhaps your sales are a little bit better than you hoped, or your prices that you can achieve are a little bit better than you thought. Again, that will give people the sense that you have really thought about it, and you thought about what things might go a little bit wrong, and look, the numbers are still about right. I'm just going to share screen again. Okay, can you, oh no, here we go. Can you see a different screen now? Jim, let me know if you can see.
Yes, I can.
Right, okay, right. So this is a really, really basic sort of financial projection example. The first page here is looking at all these costs. And I think the reason I'm showing this to you is this bottom section here. Don't just pick a number and stick it in this box up here. Explain why you've got that number. If you're going to say you're going to spend £1,500 on seasonal labour, then say that's based on, 25 weeks at 6 hours, 25 6-hour days at £10 an hour, whatever it is. Bear in mind now that these have to be minimum wage, not £10 an hour. Yeah, so for every cost you're looking at, try and think about how that cost had been derived and write it somewhere so that somebody looking at it can go, yeah, okay, that makes sense, more or less. And then you get to put it together in something like this one, where you've got, okay, this is what I think I'm going to get from selling all my different produce that you have down here. This is what my cost of sales are going to be. And then your other operating costs, your repairs and renewals, your insurances, your loan repayments. Don't forget things like that. If you've got a mortgage or a loan, you need to include that as part of these projections. And then ideally, your financial projections, if they're really thorough, they should include all these things like a bit of depreciation to show that you're setting aside enough money to be able to replace some of your important things in the future. You can get away with a slightly less intense plan, but the better plan you can produce, the better, the more plausible and the more together they'll think you are. Okay, I'm stopping sharing. Am I back with you again? So other tips about viability. Okay, so all these things are going to be projections. Obviously, the more that you can do to make sure they seem to be plausible projections, the better it is. I've said if you can show that you're going to demonstrate a profit that's as high as you can, that's great, that helps you. But if you aren't already an established business and you haven't got a track record, the chances are that you will only get a temporary permission. So you'll come back again in 3 or 4 years' time to do it all again. If you're an established business, you've either had a temporary permission or you've been living on your land and nobody caught you for quite a while. You're expected to show that you've been established for at least 3 years. You need to demonstrate that you've made a profit in at least one of those years. Preferably, it's good for you if it's in the most recent year. And then you need to demonstrate that you've got every likelihood of remaining profitable. That's the viability side of things. So top tips for people who have a business and have maybe moved on their land, but they haven't got permission. Don't rack up your costs to keep your tax bill down. Show a profit. You need to show a profit to get permission to live on your land. So many people try and keep all their tax down as low as possible, so they reduce their profit as much as possible on paper, and then they get nobbled by the planners, and suddenly they go, oh, well, I've only made 4 grand or something because of the way that they've actually managed their accounts. So do think about those things if it's important to you. Keep a good record of your sales costs and your sales income. Don't confuse capital investment costs with revenue costs. So if you have an accountant who's doing a profit and loss for you, they won't take all those big capital costs straight out of all your income in a year and say that you've made a loss. They'll use accountant's magic to present you as still making a profit. And if you are putting together an application and you're established, consider using an accountant. Even if you don't actually use an accountant to do your books and things, try and see if you can get an accountant to help you to demonstrate your profitability and your return on investment when you come to put your application in. Okay, how are we doing? That's not bad. Right, if things haven't worked out, if you got a temporary permission and here you are 3 years later and you really haven't made it work the way you thought it would, don't give up hope. It's possible that you could represent it. You can look at your business. I mean, you probably need to look at your business anyway. Look at your business, see how you might want to change it to make it try and work. And you can try and present it as, you know, this is a new business, I've changed things. And you may be able to go for another temporary permission because there's reasons why it's a new start. Okay, next thing you need to demonstrate, your attention, your ability. They want to know that you're a sincere person who's genuinely trying to, needing to be on the land because you've got a genuine desire to run a farm business. Not some chancer who wants to get a house in the countryside and you're going to flog it for £700,000 in a few years' time. Now, if you're an established grower and you've got a track record and you're known in the local community, this will be really easy to demonstrate. And also just a few lines or paragraphs at the start of your business plan will make that really clear. If you're a new entrant, then lay out in your business plan what your experience is, where if you've just gone volunteering or woofing somewhere, say so. You know, if you've had some sort of training, say so. If you've grown veg on an allotment, say so. That's all those sorts of things will alongside putting together a business plan that looks professional and plausible. Those will all help you get that your sense of your sincere intention across. And then finally, the last thing that you need to demonstrate when you put it together, this evidence, is this issue of, is there any other housing available either on the site or locally? So there's websites like rightmove.com, things like that, that list houses to rent and buy in. You can pull them up online, do a search. I would say a couple of times a year, do a search for things to rent or buy in your local area up to about 4 or 5 miles away from your site. Print off the results of your search as a PDF, file it somewhere. If you're feeling really, really enthusiastic, make a note of the date, the number of properties that there actually were at that time to rent and to buy, and how much they cost, and how far away they were by road from your site. And that's all really good evidence to roll out in a few years' time to say, look, I've been here for this long and there's only ever been 6 houses and they were all £900,000, so I can't afford it. If you have been developing your business from off-site, then keep a record of how far you've had to travel to get to your land every day. Better still, keep a travel diary of where, if your sort of patterns of travel, where you travel to regularly, how far they are, how often you go there, how often you go to your land, so that hopefully you can show an application that if you were to live on your land, the amount of travelling that you do would reduce, and that will be beneficial to you. Again, if you live off-site, record your housing costs, the costs of your basic financial needs like we discussed previously, and get a sense of how much it costs you to travel backwards and forwards to your land. And all of that will add into an assessment of viability and help make a case for you. Right, I think that's about it in a nutshell. I'll just sort of review what we've gone through and then we'll get on to Jim, who's going to talk about his particular situation at Hotchpotch. So essential needs. Keep records about the pattern of your working life. Keep evidence of it by keeping some sort of diary or a spreadsheet like the one I showed you. Keep records of the emergency situations that occur and the things that don't occur because you managed to sort it out. All of those things count. Keep records of all these other things that might happen: crime, vandalism, the costs of your local housing, the other subsistence activities that you have to do to support your life on your holding. All of those together, they'll come together to make a composite of things that contribute to your essential need. Related to that, keep all these records of your labour input. Keep a record of how many hours volunteers and other people put in. You don't necessarily have to end up presenting all of that to the council because you need to think about the things that you might be double counting, but it's a good starting place for you to get a basic idea, and probably worth reviewing that periodically and having a look and sort of thinking, Jesus, do we really put this much time in? And think about how you're recording it. So just be careful you're not double counting things, and because if you end up needing to present so many hours and necessary to run your holding, then it sort of does affect how viable it might be. Talked about profitability and viability. Talked about putting together a business plan, doing the research to back up the figures that you put into your business plan, demonstrating there's a demand for your produce, demonstrating there's a market for things, demonstrating the sort of prices that you can command. You know, a lot of growers selling direct can command much higher prices than if they were selling to a wholesaler, and that will make a big difference to your financial viability and to your financial forecasting. Keep a record of your actual household financial needs as well as your business costs. Aim to be as profitable as you can, but just bear in mind you don't need to be earning minimum wage. Oh, that's our view, and that's not what policy. Policy doesn't say you need to be earning minimum wage. Now we're actually going through a number of planning inquiries at the moment where we're really trying to challenge that. So hopefully we'll get some really good results, and that will go away for a little while again. We know. Perhaps we'll talk about this later, but if you can all think about, if you know your local authority's policies, if you know your local authority is suggesting that you need to make minimum wage, shout out in the Q&A. We know North Devon and Torridge, Dartmoor, all of Wales, unfortunately, have all tried to pull this off. I've got a client in Dorset where the ag consultant is trying to make that case. So let us know if they have in your area. Permanent permissions, think ahead from the start, try and pay some tax and make a profit. Keep your good financial records and consider getting an accountant in to help you with a report for your planning permission. And we've talked about the other housing and all those sorts of things recently. So that's it, that's me done. We'll come back to questions and answers in a while. Thank you. Jim, over to you. Tell us about your experience. How was it for you?
Oh, hello. I'll just share screen because it's nothing interesting. It is just points on it. There's nothing good to look at. Is that working?
Yes, I can see it, Jim.
Right, thanks. It's just about planning for growers, and I've put time, money and work there because they're all things that come into the issue getting the planning applications through. And unfortunately for growers, we don't tend to have a lot of spare time or spare money, and work's something we're already really well pushed on. Sorry. Yeah, that's my experience of planning. Is I just went into growing in 2000. Me and my partner settled down after number of years, and we applied for temporary planning permission in a caravan. We'd really walked into an awkward situation. We were renting the land, and we found out once we were there that there was a long-standing battle with the planners and the landowner, with enforcement history on the site. I'll put in the planning application to give us a chance to get the business going and hopefully to succeed. There was a lot of confrontation in this process, dirty tricks from the council. I was banned from the local farmers market in Tewkesbury behind the scenes. They wouldn't admit to it publicly and said, no, we don't know anything about that. But one of the planning officers visited the site and told me they'd lifted their objections during my application. And there was a huge amount of stress having to react very quickly to things that were being sprung on me. And just finding out as I went what planning policy was about. I did take it all the way to public inquiry when I didn't get a decision on the application for the local authority, which meant I'd lose my right to appeal and enforcement notices could be used. And I lost on the functional need in 2002. So after that, we moved off the site and we actually found accommodation as an affordable cottage on a much larger organic farm, arable and livestock. And after a year, the farmer there said, do you want to grow the veg here? I was really struggling managing a business from off-site. And I didn't spend the rest of my time planning for a new application in the future, although I kept an interest in planning matters and following them. We just went about life, gradually building the business up, getting our son through the local school and just getting on with life. And it worked for us, although as we were getting older, we were thinking about long-term security. And there's also, even with a really good landlord that I had, and a business that suits us, there's that long-term security for the business and decisions you can't make when everything you do is rented off the house and the land we're growing on. And opportunity came up to take on 44 acres nearby, couple of with, sorry if I'm jiggling about a bit, but I've got cramp from today's planting all day. We had an opportunity came up to take on 44 acres and also for really significant investment that I could just be paying interest on. And we thought it through as a realistic possibility of going for this, borrowing to put up a barn and a Keda greenhouse, invest in machinery and irrigation, and to apply for planning permission. Straight for full planning permission, no temporary, as we had an established business. We're sort of going for everything with one application. And after making sure it worked for us and we wanted to do it, I then spent 2 years preparing before an application went in. A year of that was preparing for an application for pre-application advice from the planners. So I spent a year getting my case together to take to the planners, my initial case. When I got advice from them, I spent the other year ticking off every single point they raised that I had to show, dotting all the I's, crossing all the T's. And then in November 2019, I put the application in. And although I'd heard it from other people, the advice Bill's giving here today, I was following to the letter and putting a lot of work in. And 2 months after putting the application in, we got permission with an AOC and a couple of other small conditions about planting screening. And it didn't even go to the planning committee. It was delegated powers. The officers approved it because there hadn't been any objections and the councillor for the ward hadn't asked it to go to them. There is a link to our planning application documents there if anybody would find them useful to look at. So the issues of money, time and work. First one, money. That's the budget just for the applications and accompanying documents for both applications I've put in. First one in early 2000s, just 380. Professional fees, they were done at a really, really kind rate for a new grower just starting up. It was ridiculously low for the work that was done to help me. And it came to 380 this time around in total. Yeah.
There's a message up on the chat here which says that people can't seem to see the slides. So I don't know if there's something there, if you're still screen sharing or if there's something not quite working out.
It says it's paused. I'll turn it off and turn it back on. Is that working?
Yeah.
Thank you. But in all those costs that built up, there's a really significant one for an architect, because I didn't have a clue about what house would be acceptable or how to build a house or how it needs designing. So involved an architect who was a customer as well as a friend. But none of those costs, apart from the pre-application advice, came before the pre-application advice. It was all my own work. It was only after I got the feedback from the planners that basically said, in principle, yes, it's all right. It would be admissible and we could support an application here if you prove all the functional and financial needs and a whole list of other policies like flooding, environment and economy. And taking it as I'd get the permission, if I did everything they said, was the time I thought I'll spend on money rather than my own work. I'll spend on other people. The architect also functioned as a planning consultant as well, tidied up a lot of work I did, and it was worth every penny. I could see on the planning statement that went in with my application, apart from the house, almost all of that is my own work. But by just changing words here and there, suddenly it read a lot better. And he advised me a lot on how to sort of lobby local opinion in councils, and could manage to open doors for me to speak to people that otherwise remained closed. But the other side of money that makes a difference, and it really helped us, is the amount of money you have to invest in your business. Even though it wasn't my own money I had, the access to money I could borrow to invest in the agricultural side straight away made the planners realise that it was a serious application and it was evidence of serious investment on my part and intention to farm. So some of these points, like time and money, if you're short of them, you can make up for it by putting in more work yourself and thinking carefully with attention to details that do work in your favour. It's not really a level playing field, but they are issues that are facing us. Next slide. Yeah, I said time. It works against you in the sense growers tend to be time poor. You can get over this if you do your work beforehand and put in an application when you want, go public then, is that things happen on the timescale that you want them to happen on. You're not being pushed by a council's actions or anything like that. And it can also, time can also work for you. The longer you've been in farming, the better your chances. And also, the longer you've been in an area, there's less likely to be local objections. That it may be unusual, somebody growing small scale veg in much of the English rural landscape nowadays, but from being a novelty, you get accepted as a hard-working local business, which does raise your chances. And I'd really stress the time spent before approaching the planners as being worthwhile. Getting them on your side at the early stage, thinking, it might be an unusual application, but it's been done seriously. Also, if you've done it really thoroughly, they will think, we don't really want this to be going to appeal with us recommending refusal, because we could be losing on appeal. Now on the work side, I think it's not just a question of the amount of work you put in, although the more you do, the less you'll need to pay on professional fees to get your application through. The more you can do yourself, the better. But it also helps how you go about it. And I'd suggest the starting point is reading and researching and trying to think objectively, not just why it's right what you want to do, but why it can be described as right in the terms of the planning policy. The first thing is to read your local plan, especially how it refers to rural workers' dwellings, because they do vary. From my first application, I remember it was PPG 7, said that security by itself is not justification for residents. My local plan, the South Worcestershire one, said security, just put security can be a ground, and a list of what it was security about. And straight away, I was adapting how I'd put what my essential need was to live on site to make it fit into policies. I was careful to be honest all the way through, not to be inventing things, but to stay on the real stuff, the facts, but to put them in a way that fits planning policies. And you don't get that without researching what those are and how planners think. The way the actual planners think and work, if you look at all the different things Simon Fairley's written, is probably the best guide I've found to it. And I think it's important to remember why you have to put so much work in. It's when we're after planning permission to support a growing business, it's exceptional. Normally, that type of development in open countryside is not allowed. You have to spend a lot of money to get a house in the open countryside. And it's an exception that's allowed to rural workers, that there can be a need for us to have a reason. So it's like a light for attracting moths. It's every chance they're under the sun and property developer getting planning permission on the rural country, in the countryside, open countryside, is like the holy grail of what they're doing. So there needs to be really, as things stand, there does need to be quite strict tests for us to prove that we need to live on the land and should be allowed to build. It's difficult for the planners to enforce agricultural occupancy conditions. They're often abused. So making it difficult to get permission in the first place is the only tool in their box, really. Just a couple of hedges away from where I'm sat at the moment, there was sometime before application, somebody got planning permission to build a house to support a poultry business. There's never been chickens there since, and I think he made good money off selling it straight away. But I think it's quite important on the work you're doing to build your planning application is to work out what you can do yourself and what you need help on. As I said, why I involved an architect, and whether you'll do the planning most of the planning work yourself, or whether you'd want somebody like Bill to be doing that. If you are using consultant and professional help, the more you learn about the policies yourself anyway, and keep records to help them, the easier you make it for people like Bill, and you'll also keep your costs down, or at least get better value for money, because you've already got all the information in a form that's useful to a professional, and it's easier to explain to them, for them to talk with you when they realise you're already on the same level as they are, the same understanding, the same page. I'd strongly suggest building a strong case before you go to the planners, rather than doing it when you're there, and to use the pre-planning application advice, even though it's a few £100s. But before then, to keep it cards really close to your chest. Don't let people know there's a planning application being prepared. So the first people you're talking to as the planners, and you have a chance for them to realise you're genuine. That partly ties in, the next point is to avoid objections. If you let this rural gossip tree grow, people will be talking about it, and people have reasons that, oh, why should they be allowed to do it? We wouldn't be allowed to build a house there. So getting the planners on your side from early stage is a good way to avoid objections. I've also, I think probably partly because of the way I live, because I wasn't thinking of a planning application, hadn't made enemies locally. You don't want somebody holding a grudge against you when you put applications in. And after a year of pre-planning, just before or at the same time as I put the planning application in, I took all the documents round in full to every neighbour, asked them if there's anything they'd like to ask me about it, and talk them over through any problems. Let me know, and I'll see if I can change my application or what I'm going to do so it isn't causing them a problem. I think that avoiding objections by getting off on a good friendly footing with all the neighbours was probably more important than getting active support. But also asked and got support from my current landlord at the time, another local farmer, and also a local grower, who all wrote letters of support. It was a lot of work. It was over the 2 years to get it through. Didn't have a holiday. We nearly got away for 4 days in Wales after the application was in. On the second one of them, got contacted to say that the parish council was discussing our application the next night, so I had to come back from it. But they didn't object after we'd talked with them. There's a last afterthought I'd add is look after yourself and your family through the planning process. Even when it goes well, it can be stressful just because the pure amount of work involved. When it's hard and confrontational and it feels like you're living in a goldfish bowl with everybody's got something to say about your private arrangements, it can be very stressful. You need to be able to switch off. You need to build your own resources and look after each other. And the other afterthought is I thought getting the permission was hard, but then the building started and I was right out of my depth, building a house, making decisions all day, every day to do with building, trying to keep a growing business going on another site. Well, we got the work done here and moved that business over. But like everybody else I know who's got permission for a rural workers dwelling and then building it, hell of a stressful experience that they've tried to blot out, normally don't remember until you start talking about it because you're going through it. But don't regret it for one moment, that it's made such a difference to how they can go ahead with the rest of their life and career. So that's all I've got to say. So
yeah, thank you. Thanks for sharing your experience. That was amazing. Yeah, can I just chip in a couple of things there before we go on to the question and answers? I think that that was a really great example of going through the process, and you were a brilliant result for you to get a permanent dwelling straight off. I know you had an established business elsewhere and you could show a track record, but still, really, you must have put so much work into it to get it there, and I'm glad it worked out for you. And I'm glad that your local authority recognises horticulture, which is very rare. I think the things that I pulled out of listening to your case study is that you do need to spend some money to improve your chances of putting a good application together for the right things. You can do a lot of this yourself, as Jim said, and hopefully from all the things that I talked about earlier, you've got a much better idea of the sorts of records and things that you should be keeping all the time, and that will make all of this so much easier for you. If you do put together your application yourself, you can come to somebody like us or somebody else who has experience of doing these things, and you could give them your documents to have a read through, have a look through before you go anywhere near the council. And that little that will be a lot cheaper than them putting the application for you, but it will maybe save you a lot of time and energy and stress in the long run if they can make some really sensible suggestions about how you can make what you're doing a little bit stronger, or, as Jim says, just change the language a little bit so you speak planner rather than farmer, which sometimes helps. Yeah, might save you some pounds in the long run, and it might save you quite a lot of sanity and stress. Thank you. Thanks, Jim. That was really, you pulled out a few really good points there.
Thanks. I've just noticed the first question that I could actually give an answer to is mention welcome and physical well-being. Would a physical disability or neurodivergence be worth mentioning, or would this be detrimental for an application? Well, I've got one of them. I'm autistic. I didn't mention it in my application because I didn't think it was relevant. Where it was really relevant was it was handy for just focusing on the work and losing myself in it, switching everything off and just totally focus on what planning rules were, what the policies, and chasing up every little detail of it. So it can play in your favour even without mentioning it.
Yeah. James, have you got anything to add from the things that you've heard? You're muted, by the way.
Of course I'm muted. The one thing I'd add, I'm a colleague of Bill's, I'm a planner rather than an agricultural appraiser, is if you do involve people like us, it can make a difference with the planning officers, because we provide an independent verification of your business and your proposals. So effectively, we can back you up, and that can carry greater weight with them. And the other thing I'd say is sometimes, like one of the cases that Bill's referred to, sometimes you just hit planners who are just not listening to your case, and you do have to go through all of the stages and go to appeal. And that's not necessarily something to be frightened of. On small scale horticultural businesses, Bill and I have a really high strike rate at appeal. So don't be put off if you hit a headwind with the local authority. There is another route, which is planning inspectors are usually very balanced people in the way they take decisions.
There's a couple of questions that would probably be better for you and Bill or James to pick up. Can you see them? One about carbon capture.
Yeah, so I think this is the question: can the current conversations about carbon capture be included to hold weight? I think the basic answer is not much. There's a really strong following of functional need, the financial test, and so on, as Bill has laid out. But it can be something that will help your case around the edges. If you are making a case for doing a highly sustainable or regenerative, can do that. Part of that is evidenced by your carbon performance through something like the Farm Carbon Toolkit. It won't harm your case at all, and it will probably help the officers and possibly councillors understand that there is there's another sort of farming out there that has carbon credentials, because most authorities have declared a climate emergency. But in terms of being a substitute for other weak bits in your case, the answer is probably not.
Yeah, and I'd add to that actually, you'd have to keep a lot of really detailed soil test records over a long period of time to actually prove that you're sequestering stuff through horticulture. There's very few horticultural businesses that actually manage to do that. I think Tully's managed to show he's raising his soil carbon through very carefully monitoring things, but a lot of people won't be able to demonstrate that. There's a question about running a horticultural site in conjunction with a social care site. So I think that's therefore less use of mechanics as a this. So that sort of seems to be about care farming. I think that I would say that in some ways, in common with some CSAs, you need to be a little bit careful, because you need to demonstrate that you have an essential need to run your site. Now, part of that need will be supervising the people who are coming to your site to work in a care farming sort of activity. But that certainly won't be necessarily all through the day and night. And if that means that you've got a pretty standard working day, it might be harder to make that case. Also, I've had one application in particular fall foul when it was a CSA, and the person that was running it just insisted on making the case that they were getting the community in to grow their veg and look after the animals. Fine, you're getting the community in to look after the veg and grow the veg and look after the animals, but that doesn't mean that you need to be there. And they didn't succeed, and they were very insistent about the way that they wanted to present it, which was great from an ethical point of view, but it didn't win any points for the planners.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a consent for essentially a care farm, which is Ambios, just outside Totnes.
Yes.
The point Bill makes is an important one, that you still need, the whole point about this bringing horticultural businesses better understood by planning is there's no such thing as a typical farm, and that's a lot of our work, is to try and explain that each case needs to be looked at on its merits. But that particular care farm had overnight accommodation for clients, so there was a need for the person running the farm to be there overnight as well. So it basically, your need to be there at unusual times still needs to have a basis in the way the farm actually works. And it's, this isn't an agricultural workers dwelling policy, it's a rural workers dwelling. So what's a rural worker? It's quite a broad set of things, but nonetheless, you do need to demonstrate that you need to be there, otherwise the business won't work properly.
Yeah. There's another question here from Timothy. Does it make a difference what type of house you want to build, i.e. negative carbon footprint and locally sourced materials? Can you want to speak to that, James?
Yeah, you want me to take that one, Bill?
Yeah, go for it.
Again, it's like the answer I gave to the carbon point in general. It may help marginally, but the whole thing with planning in this instance is basically the principle, and the principle has to be established on a functional and financial basis. So if you're close to getting that, and also you are demonstrating a really ecological approach to building, it will help, but it won't make up for weaknesses in your case elsewhere. So basically building an eco house doesn't kind of leapfrog you through this, it's just a detail.
I'd just add to that, that the type of house we went to for building was purely dictated by what was easy for the planners to accept. We knew we were asking for a lot in one application, especially with it right on the edge of an AONB. So the architect was used to getting plans through in local villages. He knew the right language, the right type of design. Things that really helped, which we were planning anyway, was having it very close to the barn and the greenhouse, so it didn't stand out. It was closely grouped. Slightly by chance, it was in a dip of the field away from the road, so it was a bit better screened. That was just the farming sensible way for organising our lives. So that all helped. And what we've ended up with looks like a converted barn. And the reason for that, the main reason, is so many barns have been taken out of farming around here that they're now a regular house all around the countryside. So it's now typical of the countryside for something taken out of farming to be a house. So that's the plan we went for.
Great, thanks, Jim. I've noticed there's a question in the chat from Rachel. Would it benefit your case if you had more than one enterprise, e.g. livestock and horticulture, for example, micro dairy and growing something like microgreens? Short answer, Rachel, it could do. Our session here today was specifically trying to focus on more horticultural based businesses, but yeah, absolutely, if that is your business, then yes, it might do, but it would very much depend on the specifics. Again, if you only have a very small number of animals for a micro dairy, that will only add a little bit to your essential needs. The whole thing has to stack up together. Right, other questions?
Just
right,
one thing I'd add to that, having different enterprises, I'd say make it suit your case if that's what you want to do. I know some people will bring livestock in to get planning,
Yeah.
and I wouldn't condemn somebody for doing that. I think you can be making a rod for your own back if you run part of your business to make it easier for planning. Is get the business you want and stick to that and make the case for it, because it can be done. Yeah,
I'd support that. If you can get a really good horticultural business together that works, then don't do something that you don't want to do, really, just for the sake of making your planning. There's a question from Grace. We're looking to buy some land and would ideally like to move onto site while starting the business and then hand in an application when we're ready for temporary permission. Do you have any insight into whether planners look negatively on growers that have moved onto site before applying for the permission? James.
Okay, so it's a double-edged sword, this one. If you move onto site without permission, you are then in breach of planning regulations and you can be enforced against. So moving onto a field, even in a caravan, because a caravan is, you don't need permission to site a caravan if you use it ancillary to the use of the land, but if you live in it, that creates a residential use underneath the caravan on the land. So there's no, caravans aren't a trapdoor, there's no loophole by which you can just move onto land and get away with it in planning terms. The double-edged sword I referred to is you're making yourself vulnerable, and I think it does create, perhaps not so much with the planners, but certainly with local residents, it can make you quite unpopular. However, it also does give you a chance to prove that the site is good for growing. But there's another way to do that. There's another way to do that, which is you can also start cultivating the site from a distance, and that definitely is an advantage if you can start to show good intent the way you're running the land. But you have to be careful that you don't prove that the farm is viable with you not living there. People get permission by having moved on first and then submitting a retrospective application. Strictly, a retrospective application is determined in no different a way to a normal one. It doesn't prejudice it in legal terms in the way it's determined, but it can create an atmosphere around it. So I think this is one to think about really carefully. It can backfire because you can find yourself, particularly if there's an enforcement notice served, you're immediately on the back foot. So, you know, I would. There are people who have done it that way, but there are also people who've got themselves in a real tangle by doing it that way, and sometimes have failed.
Yeah. Oh, plenty more questions coming in.
Yeah, there's one about outside investment, Bill. This is from Timothy. Yeah. If you're using outside investment, can you use them as a reference for making your case? I see what you think of this one, Bill, as well. But basically, planning is interested that you can financially find a way forward, that the business is planned on a sound financial basis. They're less interested in where that finance is coming from. However, it may be that the nature of your backer, the provider of your outside investment, will be something that can sort of demonstrate your good credentials. So if you're being supported by an existing agricultural enterprise elsewhere or something like that, so there's a kind of continuity. But in general, it's probably worth being transparent about, but it's not going to be a large factor in how this is received.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and it depends what sort of investment as well. If that investment is linked to some sort of obligation on your part or some sort of longer term repayment or something, and it's actually could be a liability in terms of your viability. If it's so very much depends on what the nature of that investment might be. Yeah, I think that's all I can say on that one. Pauline is asking, how about running a business on the land that isn't growing or livestock, or maybe running courses? Well, this is like a favorite of mine. Plenty of people out there want to do what they call it, ecotherapy and yoga retreats on their land and glamping. And if that was ruled as to be, if that was viewed as being a valid rural enterprise, then that would undoubtedly be way more profitable than growing vegetables, and everybody would pack in growing vegetables and have loads of hippies on their land that they would talk to nicely about how nice nature was. That's because I'm a bit of a cynic about those sort of things. I do think that ecotherapy is valuable. I think people getting in touch with the land and the environment is very, very valuable, but I don't think it really helps with the issue of planning and getting people who genuinely need to be in the countryside to make their businesses work, get a place to live there. Running courses can, but seriously, Pauline, running courses, if they're directly linked to proper rural activities that are happening on your land, can be an additional income stream, but they won't by themselves be sufficient to justify an essential need or to any of these other tests of financial profitability or viability. Don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that, James.
We got permission for Hidden Valley Pigs on Exmoor. They were running pigs in the woods and on small amount of pasture land. The main way they made their money was running bespoke courses where people came to do nose to tail butchery and so on, and make sausages. And they kind of adopted a pig throughout its life and then came and turned it into food. And that allowed them to get their income levels up to a level of a small site to justify a dwelling. So that's the point Bill made, kind of running courses that are unconnected with your agricultural business isn't going to help. Running those which add value to your agricultural business probably will, but they're less likely to give you functional need. They're more likely to give you the financial justification.
Yeah, good point.
And the final question from Natasha in the questions is, about temporary workers accommodation. Now, clearly, if you only say you need to be there some of the year, you're going to fail the functional need test straight away, because that means you're going to need to be there at most times to deal with the needs of the business. But, and there is an exception here, which is the Caravans Act. So under the Caravans Act, seasonal workers are allowed to be housed in caravans on the land. There've been plenty of people who think, oh, well, that's great, then I'll invent a season that lasts for 364 days of the year. That doesn't tend to wash. You know, the courts will regard a season as meaning sometimes on and sometimes off, and it's something which happens at particular points in the year. The other catch in that one is that you, under the Caravans Act, when the season and the seasonal workers not using the caravan has to be removed from the land. So it's not really that useful. I think caravans are helpful as ancillary accommodation for additional workers at particular pinch points in the year, but as your main dwelling, the Caravans Act is not much use to you at all.
Our council, Wychavon, South Worcestershire, does have a policy on this situation, but it's more for big scale growers where it's not feasible to sort of house a few hundred people with all coming on caravans, so it has to be built. It doesn't look like there'd be much help for small growers there, where it'd be bringing one or two on, but it may be worth having a look into. I didn't read it carefully apart from to see what it was and that it's there.
And these things are also changing. So the Devon Carbon Plan, which is taking sort of looking to the future of how agriculture might need, the future of what agriculture might need from the planning system. And I was one of the authors of the Devon Carbon Plan. It recognises that the sorts of food grain we're going to need to respond to climate emergency are likely to need both more rural workers and a more agile and flexible approach to seasonal accommodation, or just the kind of ebb and flow of a business across the years. So it recommends that this very strict approach you've heard Bill describe in really good detail this evening might need to flex as we start understanding what climate friendly agriculture is like. But that, of course, is a high level intention in a plan which all the authorities have signed up to. It's not yet made its planning policy.
Last chance to get a question in.
Jim, you're muted. I don't know if you're speaking then.
Sorry. Yeah, I'd suggest if there are not any more questions that we sort of bring it to a close, and thank you everybody who came, and hope you found it useful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Lizzie, for organising things and sorting things out. Yeah, if there's interest in the network for people to go into any of these things in a little bit more depth, like the essential need question, or a big discussion on the emergencies that people have experienced, or I think the Land Workers Alliance, or was it OGA, put together a little survey about the pros and cons of living on site I saw recently that Tully had shared with me. Something like that might make for an interesting conversation one day. Anyway, for now, thank you. Goodbye.
Well, also, I'll just give you a shout, Bill. I mean, you, in your work as an appraiser of these small enterprises, you've kind of pushed the boundaries and pushed practice forward. So thanks for the prep you put into this session, and thanks for all the good work you do for the movement.
Cheers.
Should the four speakers and Lizzie stay for a little bit to see whether we can take it from here at all?
Yep.
Sorry, I just noticed the